possible that the push for electronic health records, because I know the comment was made at this telehealth event this week that by connecting, there's going to be, you know, a ripple impact in the community. Other businesses obviously will benefit from deployment. Will things like, because Indiana has a leadership role in electronic health records and really pushing that, can that help with the deployment of broadband in rural areas around the state?
I think it could. I mean, there's a parallel obviously in life sciences, and when you have big medical centers, typically you have a bunch of life sciences companies that start populating around that. You have a whole incubation process. So now when you have the ability to essentially communicate to these major medical centers from rural areas, you might have some of these incubators now in the rural areas because they have very high-speed capability to go back to IU Medical Center or another Johns Hopkins, variety of places. And obviously it's a much lower cost in these rural areas to be able to start a business. So I think if you look at a little bit of a domino effect, I think this might be promising.
What justifies expanding broadband where the market won't necessarily support it?
Well, I think some of the things that Stuart mentioned come up. I mean, I mentioned network externalities earlier, and to the extent that the internet services that we all use are more valuable if more people are hooked up, then that's certainly a reason to do it. Something I was talking to Kim about this earlier, that the extent one can view a lot of this as being the same justifications as why you build libraries or why you have schools in these areas, that sort of thing, is that there are social imperatives behind that. Again, though, one wants to be careful about this. I mean, one of the things that an old story and a new one. The old story is that people have been around the block on this. You know, there were these rural subsidies built into the universal service rules for regular telephone service, and there were, not sure how big they were, but there were all these horror stories about, you know, who got the subsidies, people who have ski lodges in Aspen and that sort of thing. So again, are they targeted for income, or are they targeted regionally? And that also may affect the politics of these things. If they're targeted regionally, then you may get congressional delegations supporting them and that sort of thing, whereas if they're targeted for low income, they may not get the same sort of representation. The other thing is, and this again gets to something with many things I don't quite know the answer, is tying this to stimulus, saying this money came from the stimulus package. And that's obviously become a real political hot potato lately. I mean, a lot of people are making a lot of very influential political arguments about how, you know, the government shouldn't have run this kind of debt, and it's not doing any good, and this, that, and the other. You know, the unemployment rate is still high, and so on. I happen to think, for reasons that need not go in here, that one of the economists thinks that the government spending a lot of money when the economy isn't is probably a good idea. That said, it's a really good empirical question what the best way to do that is, in terms of making up for the fact that people aren't working, and whether the best way to do that is you know, subsidizing health records electronically for, you know, for a purpose for which a stimulus is put. I'm not exactly sure that that's right. It might be. I'd be kind of surprised. I suspect that probably things like you know, subsidizing construction of various sorts, that kind of thing, doing things that are actually more clearly, you know, job-related in the short term, getting people back to work, probably would have been a better idea. And I'm not sure that mixing rationales with policies where they don't quite fit very well helps anything. Whether, you know, I think part of the reason the stimulus is so confusing for so many people is it became this excuse to hang Christmas ornaments on of all sorts. And if the rationale for these broadband policies is it's a stimulus program, well, does that mean that if the economy, you know, gets better in a year or two, whenever, as I think most people hope, does that mean, well, since we don't need the economic stimulus anymore, there goes the rationale for supporting rural broadband? So again, all I can ask is just so people be clearer about why it is we're doing what we're doing.
Speaking of jobs, and Stuart, in your initial comments, you talked about the connection between broadband deployment and jobs and economic development. That hasn't, connection hasn't happened yet. What needs to happen? How long will it be? And especially as you look at in states like Indiana, which is largely rural, what should those communities really be thinking about in terms of aggressively going after this type of investment?
Well, I think a lot of it goes back to what are called community anchor institutions, which are schools and libraries and senior centers and hospitals and those sorts of things. And I think that those are really the institutions where if you have very high-speed capability at those institutions, which can then feed out into a community. Clearly, we've seen a lot of data dealing with how people look for jobs these days. They don't pick up the newspaper to look for jobs. They're online looking for jobs, and not only are they looking for jobs, but increasingly interviews are being conducted, and typically those interviews are video interviews today on Skype or some other technology. And so broadband is central to the job finding and also in the job retraining, which is really where we're at now. So many of the jobs that are lost are not coming back. And the people, if they're going to get back into the market at any point in time, are going to have to be retrained for new jobs. And typically, they're not going to be retrained on the job. They're going to have a certain set of skills before they go back into the job market to make themselves attractive. And that's where the efficiency and the availability of online learning and all sorts of programs for job retraining can take place. But again, the road to that has to be broadband, because you need a lot of those programs, for example, video and video capabilities. And as I mentioned yesterday, about 90% of the usage of broadband within 5 years is going to be for video. And so we're not talking about narrow data networks anymore. We're really talking about creating a ubiquitous national video network through broadband. And clearly there are enormous opportunities in the job market for that. And of course, for operations to be run, a lot of businesses are going offshore now, but clearly with the correct broadband connections, you can have a facility in India that you are connecting through broadband and therefore making it a more efficient operation.
Are there policies in the national plan per se that you can talk about that are positive or negative?
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you one example. It's a micro example, but actually I think I'll have a pretty good impact. There's something called the E-rate, which is our government subsidy to wire schools and institutions like that. And that program has been going on for a number of years, and it's had a very narrow type of enforcement. So literally there were rules about when the computers could be used, and they had to be used during classroom hours. Well, it turns out, as you know, that a lot of school buildings now are used for all sorts of things, including continuing education and adult education at night. So all of a sudden, with the reform of E-rate, which is taking place now, the FCC has said you are allowed to use the subsidy not just during the daytime hours. You don't have to shut off your computer at night, which means you can now have broadband in the schools where people who are going through job retraining or career planning or any of that, they can come to classes at the school and take advantage of the subsidy that we're all paying for. So I think that's one positive small step that's been taken, but will have a ripple effect because literally there are probably hundreds of thousands of people who attend adult education classes.
I have a question about this. It's occurred to me, this is really interesting. This isn't a question